Paul Verdun and Sabine Neumann, and Maya Müller and Kira Larsen, who make up the project. Of course, we were locked down, and that meant that a lot of our travel plans were canceled. And so we had to come up with different plans for our project while we were sitting basically at home and trying to carry on our team research, but apart. And one of the things that we came up with was to try, I should say that this project actually is about answering some questions about how migration shapes and transforms the political societies of the ancient Greek world. And we can say something about that. We have stuff coming out about that. You can read about that. But as a little side project, we were always concerned that there were very few hard numbers, very few facts about migration. Like the people moving about the ancient Mediterranean was like slipping between our fingers. And we wanted to say something more concrete about how people moved about. First of all, we would like to know something about absolute numbers, and that's very difficult, even the best of conditions, and especially working with non-citizens, this is difficult. But we think we can say something about the patterns, the way people moved about. And this little project that I'm presenting to you here is all about that. Yeah. Oops, that way. Then I'm pointing. No. Oh. Sorry, somehow I can apologize. How do you do that? Right, okay, I'm sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So what we did, like in the quiet evenings of lockdown, was that we compiled a database of funerary inscriptions from the island of Rhodes and from Athens, right here where we are, and compiled the funerary inscriptions for people who belong to other political communities than Athens. So we counted migrants as we see them in the funerary material. And this is something that's been done more than once before, and it's a thing that's not entirely uncomplicated. What we would like to try and paint the picture for you here is to go run through some of the methodological problems that are connected with doing such a study of funerary inscription, because there are a million ways you can do this wrong, and maybe you shouldn't even attempt to do it. We can talk about that certainly, but we're going to throw our ideas out here about how we challenge and maybe overcome some of the problems connected with this material. So let's say, first of all, that the idea is, of course, that funerary inscriptions may be interesting in trying to do a study of population, at least since in theory, or also in practice, death is democratically distributed, like one death per person, right? That's how it works. Sorry to get a little morbid, but that's sort of the basis of it. But another thing is then, how does that relate to the funerary epigraphy, the inscriptions that are left behind? How do they actually correspond to, well, not only the dead, but also the ones living? This is what we would like to test. Right. So the first thing was to compile the material and see what kind of biases are in the material and see how we could maybe work with them or overcome them. So what we did for Athens, we collected inscriptions with a name and what we call an ethnicon, even though Mogens Hansen in Copenhagen would remind me that they should be really called a politikon because it has to do with a city name or origin of a city and not necessarily of a nation as such. Right. So we counted funerary epigraphy, what we decided to call grave markers, that is inscriptions that we think in one way or another mark the final resting place, though it's not the same thing as a tombstone as we know them. But we counted in these individual people, and we excluded all blood relations, because sometimes, of course, you find families buried in the same grave with the same inscription to commemorate them. But we excluded family members, the blood-related family members, and counted only individuals. Now, we decided to give equal weight to men and women. I'll talk about that a little bit later because there's a bias here on the assumption. I will try to argue that men and women migrated in equal numbers in the ancient world. And then we put it all together in a database. Oh, actually, these are like, you've seen these maybe in the markers, the funerary markers like these. And if I can switch this one. Made it. From Rhodes, in particular, we had these osteotheci, which is a huge chunk of our material, like little stone chests. You can barely just make out here the inscription of a name on the chest, presumably the name of the person who was once inside it, or whose remains was once inside it. Right. So these things we've added up and put in our database. And this is how it comes out. Like we have 2,582 individuals from Athens in the period 400 BCE to the period to 100 CE. There are many more, but we exclude some later ones and some earlier ones. And we have about 310 from Rhodes in roughly the same period, slightly shorter period. And that means that we have enough numbers to break the Athenians down by, or the Athenian migrants down by century, but the Rhodians we cannot. We have to like chunk them all in one batch, which is not ideal. But then we have the Athenian comparanda to sort of like help us make sense of what we get out of the Rhodian stuff. So this is the database that we've set up. And this is the basis of the analyses. All right, so here we go. Methodological problems galore. We start here. Right. So the first thing is, of course, that there's a gender bias. Not an equal amount of men and women are attested in the funerary inscriptions. There are about 40% women and 60% men in this material. And we thought long and hard about why this might be. Was it because men are more likely to migrate than women? That's at least one theory that could be tested. But we took a closer look at the citizens buried there, also in Athens and in Rhodes. Interestingly enough, these are the same numbers, or the same proportion from both Athens and from Rhodes, and found that among the citizens, only 20% of the people buried are women, and 80%, I mean, I shouldn't say buried, I should say commemorated, of course. So this tells us that there's a bias in this material that has nothing to do really with the demographics of it. Obviously, there were not the Athenian citizen population was not 80% men and 20% women. That simply cannot be true, right? That must have been very close 50-50. And so this bias has to do something with the material, the way people are commemorated. Maybe men are more likely to be commemorated in stone, women in a more perishable material, or in no material at all. Whatever the explanation is, that's not really the thrust of this paper, but it's just to keep this in mind, that there is something with the material that works this way. All right. So another question, and this is not like an old question that's been debated for a long time, is how does this relate to the sort of like the social profile of the population? This has mainly been a discussion about citizens, and mainly a discussion about citizens in Athens. But it's also relevant here. We asked like how big a proportion of the population in Athens and in Rhodes are commemorated in these stone inscriptions, and the presumption is that it's fairly expensive to have a stone like the ones we saw earlier. That cost some amount of money, and so some people would not have been able to afford it. The discussion is usually whether or not you believe that a poor person in Athens would be able to afford this or that inscription, or the discussion expands. Then, is this one stone? Is that actually the whole funerary monument? Is it only part of the monument? Is it a bigger monument? Is it more expensive? Because every once in a while we find, demonstrably very wealthy people buried in, with very cheap-looking funerary inscriptions. So, but we think this debate is not really going anywhere as we see it. But we think we might actually be able to add one little perspective to this debate, and that is by looking at the Rhodian material, which has been left out of this discussion. Because in the city of Rhodes, people are adopted, as they are everywhere, but the Rhodians, they keep the name of their natural fathers as part of their names. And so their name phrases carry this distinctive mark of whether or not people are adopted in Rhodes. And so we can see that in the funerary material, 5.5% of all the citizens are in fact adopted. Whereas if we look at lists of magistrates, where we assume that the wealthier members of society are more active, then it's 11% in the city of Rhodes, and in the town of Lindos, on the eastern coast of Rhodes, it's approximately 37% of magistrates, priests active there that are adopted. The story about adoption is very interesting in itself, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on it here. But it just gives us some kind of idea that the material, we're looking at the funerary material, captures a broader section of the population, even though we can't say exactly how much broader section of the population. But it should push us in the right direction, seeing we capture actually some part of the population there. All right. Okay. So the next thing, of course, is origins. And this is what we're interested in. We're trying to figure out where people are from and see if we can we're going to plot them out on a map soon enough, as I basically did there already. But we want to ask, is this in any way, how does this relate actually to the Metic population of, in this case, Athens? Can we be sure that when there are a lot of people in the material from Heraclea, that also reflects that there were a lot of people from Heraclea living in this case, fourth century Athens? Yeah. So there are some ways of testing that. One way of testing it is when looking at Athens, is that we have other kinds of inscriptions, other epigraphic genres, as we would say, where we have foreigners attested as well. So in the case of Athens, we have numerous individuals from Heraclea and Miletus and Antioch, and we see these people, for instance, in lists of ephebes, that the same cities dominate there. So that's sort of like a gauge of our tally, that it's not completely out of whack. And then again, for Rhodes, we have another way of comparing, just giving a basic comparison. In this inscription you see here on the right, which is an Ephesus subscription list from the 1st century BCE, with donations from 69 foreign individuals living in Rhodes, presumably. And then we can sort of like tally that against our corpus, our Rhodian dead, as it were. And we can see like individuals from Antioch are the most numerous givers. They're also the most numerous in our material. Ephesus and Alexandria, and so on, like Laodicea, Phaselis, and Halicarnassus. They're not exactly the same proportions, but it's sort of, the same cities that we encounter in all these places. All right. So this sort of like encourages us to think that we have at least some idea that the people who show up in the funerary epigraphy are fairly representative. We don't mean to suggest that you can sort of like read exact ratios against each other, but when there are a lot from Miletus and not very many from, say, Corinth, that should indicate that there were more people from Miletus than from Corinth. But we don't mean to suggest that you should read like 4 guys from Corinth and 2 guys from Messenia. That means there are twice as many Corinthians as Messenians, or something like that. That would be false precision, we think. All right. Yeah. So let's go. All right, what I'm going to show you here are a couple of maps, and I should credit Maya Müller, a member of our team, who contributed to the analysis here as well, but also you will see her work most illuminated here on the screen, because she did the maps. She's fabulous at doing those as well, and give us a picture of what we're looking at. This is the dead foreigners in Athens in the 4th century BCE, approximately 450 of them there are, and they're put on the map here to give you an idea of where they're from. So the first thing we draw from this is that people are from everywhere, right? From everywhere in the Aegean and beyond. People are represented in the necropolis of Athens. But it's not, a complete random distribution. There are certain patterns to this. And we just point out, for instance, that in the 4th century, there are a lot of Olynthians and there are a lot of Plataeans, which we are inclined to read as a reflection of Athenian history in the late 5th century and then 4th century, of cities allied with Athens who sent refugees in these periods. And we feel encouraged saying that because they basically disappear after the 4th century. I'll show you a later map in a moment. But what I wanted to point out, first of all, is these kind of clusters of migrants in Athens. First of all, I think this is the most striking thing, is like this bubble of people who are basically, well, these are overlapping dots here, but there are many smaller ones also in the middle of the big dot. It's Thebans, I think. other Boeotians, and also the cities. Actually, you can't see that very well on this map. The cities of Evia and of the eastern Peloponnese are well represented, as well as the Cycladic islands. So there's sort of like a cluster of migrants who came from actually not very far away, who live close by. They're more numerous from each place, and the places where they're from are sort of closer together than elsewhere. There's another cluster around Miletus. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And then this huge chunk of Heraclea up here, and the Propontis generally as well. So these are like the basic layout of the 4th century. I'll stay a little bit with the 4th century, I think. Because this is an opportunity to look, it's an opportunity to look a little closer at the sort of like regional Athenian cluster. So it's basically the same map as you saw before. The red dots are funerary inscriptions. Now, so that's one we've already seen that there's kind of a regional pattern to that as already. But we have an opportunity to study this sort of like regional cluster a little bit closer, because it happens that from the island of Chaos, there's a list of proxenoi from the middle of the 4th century, so in the middle of the period that we're studying here. A list of proxenos named with his name, of course, and with his ethnic, and that allows us to sort of like map out on again on the map here the small world of the city-state of Cathaia. Where did the Cathians believe it was a good idea for them to be represented, as it were, by a proxenos, to have friends to assist the citizens? It's again as an indication of where people might actually go, the places they might visit, and these are the yellow dots. They seem to like hug the same basic area as the funerary inscriptions. And again, as it happens, or this is even more a coincidence, we might say, we happen to have a single inscription from the city-state of Cyrene that tracked donations of grain in the late 4th century to, among other places, Athens. And these are the green dots, the cities that received donations of grain in the late 4th century. This is, I'm basically reading off Alain Bresson's interpretation here. Again, Bresson suggests that the reason these cities needed a grain donation from Cyrene was not that harvest had failed in this region or anything like that. It was probably more likely that the harvest had failed or was not as rich as it used to be in one of the places where these cities would normally get supplies from. And so all these cities would not necessarily be hit by the same drought or whatever, but they would all be dependent on the same region for imports of grain. But again, I think like what is interesting to note is that it sort of like overlaps with the network, and this indicates to us that there is something going on about the flow of information. Comes from the grain network. Something about the flow of people and trade. Generally, these are the proxenoi that we could sort of like bounce off that, and then also that people moved and settled in Athens within the same network. So it suggests to us that there is something about the traffic, the transportation costs within a regional network like this that also drive people to sort of like consider their options within the same kind of network when they are moving for whatever reason they are moving. Another thing that we might just pause and say about the proxenoi network is that we have an opportunity to study Athens' network from an outsider, really. Because even though we're talking about Cathaia, the big blob here, the yellow dot, is I think it's 15 proxenoi that the Cathians appoint in Athens. So Cathaia apparently sees itself as sort of like on the periphery, actually, of a network that is centered in Athens. And that sort of like is encouraging also for comparison with our funerary network, which is by definition centered on Athens, because this is where all the funerary inscriptions are found. All right. Okay, but there's a little more to this. We'll follow the Cathians a little bit more, because though there was this regional cluster around Athens, an Athenian regional network, as we might say, there is actually another cluster of Cathian proxenoi, and they are based here in the Propontis. And again, there is also a dense little cluster here of foreigners buried in Athens. And And I think I was mentioning before that we might think of the grain shortage in the late 4th century as having to do with some supplier that was not able to deliver as they otherwise did. And I think the arrow sort of like points this way towards the Black Sea. And that means also we're going to have to talk about Heraclea here. So on the one hand, we have this regional network, densely packed little city-states around Athens, sending people to Athens, but then there are the Heracleans. They are by far the biggest group of migrants to Athens in the 4th century. Lots and lots of them, and they will continue to be over the centuries. And I suppose there's a problem that I have to address first here, that I say Heraclea as if there's only one Heraclea, but there are in fact a lot of Heraclea. The Copenhagen Poleis Center names 8 of them, and some of them are easy to do away with because they were not called Heraclea in the 4th century and so on. Some of them are very small and very far away, but I have to underline that in a sense we're guessing here, or maybe just only guessing, maybe a little bit more, because we happen to know for the end of the 4th century a lot of activity between Athens and Heraclea. Issues of proxenia between the two places, honors passed for Heracleots living in Athens or doing business in Athens. And here I have to be a little bit careful because my argument is becoming very, very circular, or a little bit circular anyway, saying that this is the reason. But we happen to have comparanda from Rhodes, and I'll show you that in a little bit, from Ephesus. The same kinds of connections with Ephesus, trade connections and grain trade connections. Oh, we're still here. Good. Documented in the 3rd century there. And since there's only one Ephesus, or at least a lot fewer Ephesus, that helps us along with our measurement. But I have to say, of course, there are other possibilities for Heraclea, certainly. All right. Okay, so we're going to zoom out a little bit again. This is still the 4th century. This is still the overlapping networks of Athens and Cathaia and the Cyrenian grain shipments. But I think we're already beginning to sort of have an idea of how this might work, and we'll put a little more evidence to it in a second. Regional cluster, densely packed, probably lots of opportunities to travel, ease of travel, low transportation cost, and then sort of like an extra regional hub, a jump to another region, as it were. And this is important when we begin to consider the evidence as it moves forward. So, here again, the 4th century, and I want to show you the 2nd century. I'm going to skip a century here to move us on. This is what happens as time passes in Athens. Basically, you see the same like regional cluster, but then we have an explosion of a handful of cities. Heraclea keeps building up. Miletus becomes a giant. Eventually, 25% of all metics buried in Athens will be Milesian citizens. And then also Antioch. These are the 3 biggest contributors. Now, we've already suggested that there is some kind of trade connection with Heraclea. We can come up with other reasons for Miletus and Antioch, but not very good ones, to be quite honest. But we have to consider, so if we can't make the exact connection, what is the explanation for this kind of explosion in the numbers of a few places? One very realistic option that we are trying to test is, of course, that people settling in Athens maintained their lives in Athens, had families, had children, and then passed on their Milesian citizenship or their Heraclean citizenship for generations and generations. And so actually you would have communities that grew large in Athens as the years passed. It's certainly consistent with the record as it's shown here, but it's very difficult to test. I'm going to just give you an idea in a slightly different color of Rhodes, where we have some kind of means of testing. So over here you see Ephesus as one of the giants of the Rhodian necropolis. Antioch, interestingly, is here as well. And Alexandria would be somewhere down here, also very important in Rhodes. Now, the first thing we should get out of the way is the idea that maybe this is just the biggest cities of the Hellenistic world. So if people were sort of like just move the same amount of people or proportion of people from every place, all that things being equal. Well, the Antioches and the Heracleots and Milesians and Ephesians, they should just be the biggest groups in every city, everywhere where we had migrants. But there's something that indicates that that is not so. First of all, here is Ephesus, but Miletus is completely missing from the record in Rhodes. We have Antioch, sure, that's there, and Heraclius is also kind of there. But Ephesus is huge here. I'll just go back one for a comparison with Athens in roughly the same period. Here's Miletus, but then Ephesus doesn't really register in this. So if it was just a question of Miletus and Ephesus being huge places, why would people from Miletus be found only in Athens and people from Ephesus be found only in Rhodes? It's not a question of the distance either, because Miletus is actually closer to Rhodes than Ephesus is, and I can't figure out exactly the distance to Athens, but that's basically the same, right? So distance or size of populations cannot really be the explanation. It's got to be something else going on. We suggest tentatively that this is not an original idea for this study. It's been proposed before, that there must be some kind of political privilege associated with being a Milesian in Athens and an Ephesian in Rhodes, or something similar to that. That would explain this, but still it doesn't explain necessarily how it would keep growing. But for Rhodes, again, wrong way. We do have the possibility of a kind of a test of this, and that is because the Ephesians who are buried in Rhodes tend to, over time, write their names in Doric form. Now, Dorians buried in or living in Rhodes, Ionians or Ionian-speaking Greeks living in Rhodes do not necessarily change their name into Dorian dialect just because they are in Rhodes. There are a lot of Demetriuses who will insist that they are still called Demetrius, but there are also some who, after a while, perhaps would change their name to Damatrios, or even some more Rhodian names than that. So there's maybe an indication that people, living generation after generation in the same place would retain their citizenship and then stay being Ephesians or Miletans, but in other ways, like changing their names around to fit the local environment, as it were. And eventually, in the 1st century CE, we begin to encounter the name formula of somebody being an Ephesian from Rhodes or Cnidian from Rhodes. There's one case of an individual buried in Cnidos who calls himself a Cnidian from Rhodes. Kind of unique that you carry your ethnicon when you're at home, but then he's not really at home. So something suggests that there might be communities of citizens who identify not with their own city, but with another city as having lived there for a while. All right. Good. I'm skipping bits here, but we can talk about that later. I'm just going to basically sum up what this shows us, and we can throw in more if you like afterwards. So what we think we're seeing here is that migration in the centuries that we cover here occurs in two different modes. One is within very small regions, closely connected cities or sending citizens, and these metrics are in fact not very far from home. They're not the Lycias or families migrating across the Mediterranean. They're actually within walking distance, some of them, from where they are full members of a polis. And the other are these sort of like extra regional cities, fairly far away, but who contribute huge chunks of the migrants to one place. All right. This is sort of like the patterns we've traced so far. We have the Rhodian comparanda we can go into if you'd like that, but this is basically the talk. Thank you very much for your attention.